Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospect of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 20th of November 2025, Dr. Iris Vidmar of the University of Rijeka addresses us on the topic of harmful art and the role of art criticism in shaping our understanding of works which can be seen as upholding or promoting morally harmful perspectives. Taking Margaret Mitchell's novel Gone with the Wind as our main example, Dr. Vidmar argues that rather than cancelling such works, we should adopt the techniques of what she calls ethically minded criticism, which allow us not only to grasp the moral issues at hand, but also harness these for the purposes of our own moral education.
Thanks everybody for coming, and a special thanks of course to our speaker today for taking the time to share her work with us. I'm assuming most of you know Iris Vidmar, who's a regular attendee of various aesthetics conferences both in the US and Europe. She is, to me, the figure of philosophical aesthetics in the part of Europe where she is working, namely Croatia. She is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Rijeka, which is a very nice place to visit, I can say from personal experience. She has published extensively on literary cognitivism, on fictional characters, on poetry, and then also on Kant, and TV series, films, various things. But I think it's fair to say that literature and cognitivism are the red threads of her research. And she is therefore a very natural choice for us to have join for these seminars. So I'll stop talking now and pass the word to Iris.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, for taking the time to hear my talk. It's a privilege and an honor to be in such a group. I think pretty much everyone on my screen has influenced my work so much that it just goes beyond saying that this is like the peak of my presentations ever. So yeah, thanks for that. So what I'm going to present today is actually a kind of a mixture of two projects that I'm currently working on. One of which relates to, and this is just the baby steps, the initial steps to my kind of take on the importance and the value and the impact and the cognitive and the epistemic relevance of art criticism, which is what I was kind of trying to do given the overall theme of these seminars. And another one is something that I have been working on for quite some time now, and this is the kind of an issue that I have, or my kind of attempt to wrap my hand around what is happening with something that I guess most people would call cancel culture, for better or for worse, depending on how you feel about the term. But what I was really concerned with for quite some time was the fact that I forgot to share my screen, sorry. The fact that, as Elizabeth kindly put it, and thank you for that introduction, I really, as someone who defended aesthetic cognitivism for so long, I was really, I had an issue on how to really kind of keep defending aesthetic cognitivism given what was claimed about certain works of art. So I guess the project that I'm nowadays developing has to do with questioning the kind of ethical and political status of what I'm calling harmful works of art with respect to how we should engage with them. Not so much from the perspective of, let's say, value interaction debate, but more so from the perspective of our public policies, in particular, our educational policies. So just to give you an idea of what I have in mind by harmful art, can you see my change of slides, hopefully? So you can probably recognize, I'm going to use just as an example, the work Gone with the Wind, whether the film or the book, it doesn't really make much difference to my argument. But what I'm kind of getting at is this idea, and I'm relying here on Paul Taylor's account of harmful art, which he kind of classifies as art which can inspire different kinds of social harm. So whether it's racism or a kind of, sexualist attitudes, misogyny, all kinds of things, right? And in that respect, as Taylor argues, artworks can be, you have a full quote here, artworks can be, it seems, a very powerful force in kind of keeping a certain kind of prejudice or spreading a certain kind of stereotypes and harmful stereotypes about different groups of people. So in that respect, of course, Gone with the Wind is notoriously famous for the way in which it kind of misrepresented quite a few things about the American Civil War and about the whole issue of racism. So one line of criticism concerns the treatment of the character of the slave character of Prissy, where Black people are represented as kind of irrational, animalistic, not really capable of taking care of themselves in, you know, a kind of a way in which we don't want to feel or think about another race. Of course, particularly famous is the treatment of Black people through the character of Mummy, which is particularly problematic in the sense that not only is she repeatedly represented as someone who is, you know, living a very happy life with the O'Hara family, she's actually represented as someone who is a kind of authority to them. So there are quite a few places in the work itself when Scarlett is kind of, she has to, you know, she has to make sure that Mommy doesn't get angry at her, and Mommy is represented as someone who kind of has quite a lot of authority. All the more so if you remember, given that she's the one who is very ferociously opposing the war. She doesn't want to be liberated. She doesn't want her own freedom. She doesn't think there's anything wrong with the way in which the social system is developed. And of course, there are the issues with the Ku Klux Klan and the way in which it is misrepresented as actually being a kind of good and protective rather than being a kind of, you know, at the function of actually destroying the lives of Black characters. So in that respect, this novel seems to me to be a very good example of what people would call harmful art. And then, of course, the question is, how are we supposed to deal with that, right? And what is happening nowadays is that these and similar works of art, and you can think of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, of Mice and Men, Othello, a whole bunch of works, which is now being classified as harmful and problematic. And what is happening is that these works are being subject to what I'm calling preventive measures. So by preventive measures, I have in mind measures which are implemented into the public policies concerning our artistic practices with the aim of preventing or neutralizing the alleged capacity of these works to contribute to this kind of social injustice. So there's a wide range of them. You can think about restricting access to these works. So Gone with the Wind was at one point actually removed from the online streaming services, then it was put back. You can think about removing such works from the public or educational space, so people no longer teach certain works, or they are kind of not really happy about it. They want to ban them from the libraries, from the education, etc. They are quite often labeled inappropriate for cultural reasons, for misrepresentations. They are being subject to various kinds of censorship. And of course, depending on your views, you can also think of cancel culture as one big preventive measure. So my question, I guess, is, you know, given all that is happening, how are we supposed to react as aestheticians, as people who enjoy art, but also as people who are very vividly aware of the morally problematic attitudes that this work have? And I have to say, at least for today, for the purposes of this paper, I am really kind of narrowing my interest to works of art which have been created in the a kind of not necessarily far away, but definitely distant time. So something that is not, let's say, contemporary art. And what I want to suggest is that Gone with the Wind shouldn't be prohibited from the public spaces, so it shouldn't be subject to preventive measures. And what I want to show actually is that doing so canceling it, restricting access to it, etc., it's not only an aesthetic harm, but primarily an educational one, in the sense that it robs the public of the capacity to gain important insights into the specific political and social circumstances which are in fact depicted in the novel. So in a way, what I'm suggesting is that canceling or restricting access to or censoring these and similar works of art robs us of the opportunity to engage with some of the most ethically and politically troubling aspects of our culture. And the crucial part, I guess, of my argument is that we can understand those problematic, potentially morally corruptive aspects of these works more readily today because we engage with such work. So basically, my claim is that if all these preventive measures are being implemented with the aim of restricting a certain kind of moral harm, my suggestion is that doing so would actually hinder the precise moral change that these initiatives try to accomplish. However, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be aware of all the problematic attitudes that these works exhibit. And in that sense, of course, we should recognize the need to approach these works with the full awareness of how morally problematic they are. And I'm trying to develop that. I don't think I'll have enough time to go into that today, but basically that's the whole approach that I'm calling ethically minded art criticism or ethically minded aesthetic education. I'm kind of still working in between these two. So basically, in order to convince you of that, I'm trying to, I present three different arguments, which I'm then trying to unite into my own account. So what I'm trying to suggest is that we shouldn't treat these works as prescriptive in contemporary context, right? Of course, when Margaret Mitchell first wrote this novel, it did have a certain political function, and it was supposed to be taken as a defense of the slavery system, as a defense of racism. And in that sense, for her contemporary audience, for people, in the generative context, as sometimes, for example, Ted Nanicelli puts it, it did have a very problematic moral function that it was supposed to fulfill. What I'm trying to suggest is that that function, that prescribing a certain attitude towards a group of people, is actually lost in our contemporary culture. And I'll develop this in more details. So the first step of my argument is to argue, to invoke those ontological accounts of art, and Professor Lamarck has defended one such. I think David Davies also has a similar view, where the actual identity of the work of art is of course related to its what they call origin of creation, right? As Peter says, a work is a species of intentional object in the sense that what it is partly but essentially linked to how it came about and how it is thought or taken to be. Now, of course, this is something that is quite often recognized by people who subject Gone with the Wind to restrictive measures, in the sense that they will say, these views are the result of the contemporary with Mitchell's, right? With Mitchell's audience. But I'm trying to suggest that there's actually more power to that argument than it is sometimes recognized, particularly, I think, with respect to some other works, such as The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and the very problematic use of the racial slurs there. So what I'm trying to suggest is to actually relate this kind of ontological account about the importance of the context of the work creation, and I'm combining that with the work that comes from people who work on moral blame, and in particular, I'm relying a lot on Miranda Fricker's account of the relativism of blame, whereby she's trying to show that people can, in a sense, only be held responsible for having a certain moral attitude if having that kind of a moral attitude can be seen as a kind of a fault of their own, so to say, right? So the idea is that the kind of racial, racist attitudes that are at the core of Gone with the Wind isn't necessarily exclusively the fault of Margaret Mitchell, but it's a kind of what Fricker would call the routine way of thinking of her own times, and you can see more developed argument by Fricker here. And it seems to me, when you go back to not only to the literature about the plantation fiction and the war for liberation fiction, but also to the historical accounts, and I have given you a few quotes here, you can really see the extent to which this kind of, some people would call it white supremacy views, were actually embedded into the dominant, of course, cultural discourse of the time, right? So in a sense, and of course, this is still something that is widely recognized by many people, it's not necessarily so that Margaret Mitchell was kind of, in writing this novel, presenting her own view. It is basically her idea that she was, in a way, contributing to the social discourse on this particular issue. And from her perspective, given the kind of background to which she belonged and the kind of, again, moral and political views, that she actually kind of felt that she was, let's say, defending the right view. And now, of course, you can say, well, that is just wrong because they have just fought the war to show that they are right, they lost the war. So they should have been available, they should have been aware of what is sometimes called the pioneering moral beliefs, right? They should have been aware about the, let's say, Uncle Tom's Cabin. They should have known better. They were aware. There were people, quite a few people, who were trying to suggest and who were actively asking them to abolish the practice itself, right? So this argument could be wrong in the sense that we can't really hold her morally blameless because it was kind of an acknowledged fact that there was the opposite moral view, right? And there's, I think, a lot of power to that argument. And I guess how you end up believing, or the kind of power that you end up thinking this argument has, concerns the overall views that we have and the overall theories that we have about the problem of moral progress itself, right? So on the one hand, we do know that moral progress takes a lot of time, and we do know that it doesn't happen overnight, and that just being, in a way, confronted with a different moral outlook is quite often not sufficiently powerful to convince you to change your own mind, right? So again, this is something that comes from empirical research. This is something that comes from philosophical research. I rely in the wider version of this paper on philosopher Hannah Sauer's theory, whereby I'm kind of just trying to suggest that this fact that people were aware of the opposite moral views in itself isn't sufficient to actually change their views about that. Now, of course, you can still argue, well, she should have known better. We should have known better, right? And because we now know better, that gives us a reason to just cancel the work, not allow it to kind of be spread, be talked about. You know, it is the second most read work in America, apparently. So obviously, you know, if Paul Taylor is right, if these people who believe that art can actually spread racial stereotypes, if they are right, and if you also consider a very frequent testimonies about the kind of painful experience from the point of view of the Black audience and a kind of shameful experience from the point of view of white audience, you can really question the argument here and say, we just have a lot of reasons to just, you know, be gone with the wind. Let's just not put it out there anymore. So what I'm trying to suggest, and going back to what I was previously claiming, that doing so would actually diminish or invalidate the very moral progress that we are trying to achieve. In suggesting that, I am claiming that a kind of discrepancy in the moral outlook of Mitchell's audience and contemporary readers provides a kind of a safety net, whether it's sufficient, as it said here, let's say it is, for contemporary readers to engage with the novel without actually succumbing to the work's pro-slavery attitude, right? So I want to suggest that we can engage with that, but again, not from the point of view of Mitchell's original intended audience, but from the point of view of contemporary audience where racism, it's no longer what Bernard Williams, for example, would call a life option, right? Of course, I'm not denying the fact that racism is still an important fact, but I'm then trying to suggest that the kind of a moral progress that we have made as a society from Mitchell's day to nowadays kind of gives us sufficient means to fight that very racism that is still alive with some audience members. And I'm trying to show that it is actually within the proper, let's say, context of art criticism, we can actually use the novel so that it itself becomes one of these, let's say, resources that we have in order to combat racist attitudes, right? So the idea is that the fact that this moral discrepancy in generative and reception context didn't exist for Mitchell's contemporaries, I think explains the discomfort and shame that we feel when we read the novel today or we watch the movie. And I want to suggest that we can exploit it for the purposes of moral learning. So it is this potential of moral learning, on my view, that grounds the claim that Gone with the Wind shouldn't be subject to preventive measures, not the idea that it is the result of its own times, right? So I'm kind of trying to push that a bit forward. And then again, in the paper, I'm developing this quite extensively. And I'm trying to show that there are some useful epistemic benefits, or that there is epistemic potential in this kind of a harmful art. And in doing so, I rely on the research in critical race theory and a lot of research on ignorance in epistemology, and particularly on what is called white ignorance, right? So according to these theories, there is a lot of pressure by the contemporary, let's say, people in power, so to say, or dominant racial groups in power who are trying to kind of keep certain historical and, in that respect, historical facts kind of under the rug, so to say. So what people in critical race theory are kind of trying to suggest is that we need to find a way to actually bring those who were subordinated into the general public discourse. And I'm trying to suggest that putting this kind of a work into the public discourse rather than removing it is one of the ways in which we can actually raise this awareness about the different kind of ignorances that people have towards the racial issue. To be more precise, I'm trying to suggest that this kind of a work gives us the epistemic potential to understand what I'm calling the perspective of a wrongdoer. And this is where Margaret Mitchell's kind of moral blamelessness, if that's the word, comes to the fore, right? So when you read Gone with the Wind or when you watch the movie, what you see is, of course, a terrible, terrible display of the most, one of the most brutal system that ever existed. But it is kind of depicted from the point of view of those who were actually doing it without being aware or kind of ignoring the fact that they are doing that. So it seems to me that in that respect, engaging with this work gives us an important element of cultural knowledge that can, in a way, help us make the notion of slavery less abstract. It can help us understand the social dynamics that existed between those groups of people. It can help us to position ourselves in relation to it and understand better our social experience, regardless of the social or racial group to which a particular reader belongs, right? And in that sense, I think the work provides us with interpretive resources for making sense of our own experience, past to present experience, right, to our country's past to present experience, to our culture generally. And in claiming that, I rely on a work by Jose Medina, who argues that, this is a quote from him, the privileged white subjects tend to lack the motivation and the opportunity to develop expressive activities and interpretative tools to make sense of their own social experiences of racialization and to understand how their lives have been affected by racism and its legacy. And it seems to me that enabling people to engage with harmful works of art, which are in kind of problematizing this particular experience, can do something along these lines, right? It can really help people kind of relate more to something that is being ignored. And I have found frequent references in the literature about the kind of problematic way in which educational system itself is actually treating the issues of slavery. So even if it is a kind of announced as, this is what was happening, it doesn't really give you the actual details, the kind of, the perspective of those who were harmed. So in that sense, I think this and the similar works, of course, provide precisely that kind of epistemic access into this particular experience, whether from the perspective of the wrongdoer or from the perspective of those who were harmed. Of course, there is few of that in Gone with the Wind, but there are perspectives on those who were harmed in other works. So in that sense, I think it enables us, it kind of gives us an access to wrongdoers to, in a way, face their own moral shortcomings, right? Because now, as I mentioned before, we have reached this state within the culture when we recognize this issue. We are, in a sense, better equipped to also recognize the moral shortcomings of the previous regimes that were there. And I guess the positive benefit of that, or the kind of the end game, would be in avoiding what Miranda Fricker calls future hermeneutical marginalization of people who were, kept in these terrible conditions, by enabling them to contribute to the shared pool of concepts and interpretative tropes that we use to make generally shareable sense of our social experience and to bridge the gap between the social space of those in dominance and those kept away from the power. So that's kind of my idea. Removing the work from the public space, restricting access to it, would only, rather than making the moral progress available, it would actually contribute to this kind of ignorance that is already considered to be quite a big of a problem. And finally, I also want to suggest that the work itself gives us an idea of the kind of moral growth and collective moral progress that people have made from those days to today, which is, I think, very important. And again, within this whole discussions about moral progress in ethics, it seems to be quite motivating in the sense that it can really help us understand some of our current social issues, so we can transfer, hopefully, knowledge that we get from that respect into some of our own contemporary practices. You can think about the question of minorities nowadays, the immigrant issue, which is even now in Croatia becoming more and more of a thing. So hopefully it also, I want to suggest, adds to the richer cultural awareness, because it's more easier, I think, to understand the kind of racial issues that we are still struggling with today, given that we are given the chance to understand what it was happening and how it was happening, going back to its very beginnings. So that's kind of the overall issue that I want to defend. But then, of course, at least few problems emerge. So you can still wonder whether Mitchell and her audience is in fact morally blameless due to the changing climate during the publication and the writing of the novel. So we are back to questioning whether, whether the whole thing that she really thought she was contributing to the, right side of the debate, however hard that is for us to understand. So if racism is still a live option and the alleged safety net doesn't exist, does that give us a reason to actually cancel the work? And of course, if that is a live option, then we really should be then probably my argument doesn't work. But this brings us to the question of contemporary art, which can be seen as kind of problematic, and I'm leaving that aside for the moment. I think there's a lot to be said, and we need to be very careful about the experience of reading or watching, which can be hurtful or harmful or painful for Black audience members. But we should also consider the experience of watching or reading this work, which can be very shameful, of course, for the white audience. So how am I supposed to solve that? And in order to do that, I'm trying to develop this notion of the ethically minded art criticism, where I think a couple of notions should be important. So aesthetic communities, interpretative practices should be kind of respectful, and they should collaborate so as to promote unrespectful exchange of opinions, which are then triggered by the work of art. It's also very important for me that people are aware of, and that we teach people, students, particularly about the knowledge of the relevant art context. It seems to me that quite often, but maybe this is just a thing in Croatia, I don't know, but it seems to me that quite often when people are advocating for some kind of preventive measures, they are kind of taking this ahistorical view of the work, and they're not really considering, again, the kind of ontological basis of the work and the kind of identity that the work has because of its particular generative context, right? So the awareness of the socio-historical context within which the work was created should also be an important element. Focus on moral norms depicted in the work and critical engagement with them, right? So probably you can hear a little bit of Martin Nussbaum here in the background. And I'm not trying to suggest that we should deliberately instrumentalize works to do that. It is just that given that they are available within our public space, given that they are within the educational system, they do offer this kind of potential for learning. There is an educational potential in them, which should then be, I think, capitalized. We should also encourage discussion about the norms and how they inform philosophical work in moral philosophy and, of course, other relevant philosophical theories. This maybe doesn't necessarily concern Gone with the Wind, but if you work on, let's say, erotic art or pornographic art or violent art, I think it's very important there to speak to the psychologist and to see what it is actually that research is telling us about the way in which, as the audience, we process this kind of problematic works. I think it's also important to keep in mind what epistemologists refer to as epistemic humility and the desire to overcome one's epistemic and ethical limitation. My theory has always been that works of art themselves won't really make a lot of cognitive or ethical contribution if the audience itself isn't really prepared and open to that. So, and this is again in this context important for these ideas that there is a lot of active white ignorance and that there is a lot of kind of even a kind of blindness to the fact that people can be even more prone to maybe have racial attitudes that they actually acknowledge themselves. So in that respect, epistemic humility is something that is really important. Also, an attitude of understanding, which looks at the possibility of reparation of social bonds rather than an eye for an eye reciprocity, in the sense that, yeah, we should treat these works as, not intended to actually promote future harm and further stereotypes or prejudice, but actually as something that can really be put at the service of reparation of these kind of social bonds, right? And what I'm really, and this is, I guess, the main reason why I'm trying to suggest that we shouldn't just ignore works of art and restrict access to them, is that engagement with multiple works of art concerned with the relevant issue and approaching it from the opposite of multiple sides. So we should give people to read Gone with the Winds, but you should also teach them Elizabeth Barrett Browning's, for example, abolitionist poetry, which is beautiful and wonderful and really kind of helps you see the slavery in a completely different way. So in that sense, I think restricting access to some works can be very dangerous because you then lose voices which can actually contribute to these kind of debates that we have. And then just to wrap it up, because I think I'm running out of time, as a good example, what I think it's a good example or something that could really help me understand few issues about this whole problem better is, as I mentioned before, an ethically minded art criticism, which is conducted roughly along the lines I try to suggest. So an example for me would be Sarah Churchwell's book, The Wrath to Come, which really kind of contextualizes Gone with the Wind, going back to the very origins of slave system in America and then bringing it back to contemporary Trump political arrangements and stuff like that. So that I'm just giving you here as an example of a work of art criticism, which I really think it's an excellent contribution to the debate, whereby saying, okay, you should engage with this book, but with the full awareness of the problems it has. And once you do that, you are actually better positioned to understand certain important elements of our own contemporary culture. And you can see just a few examples of the kind of critical praise that she got for her book by her colleagues. And I also want to suggest that a good art criticism doesn't only help us understand better this relation between the work and what the work is about, it's kind of representational, expressive, etc. aspects. It also helps us understand something about our current culture. So it does approach the work, but it's also kind of insightful, not only on, I don't want to engage with that today, but of course a good work of art criticism should explain and help us see and understand and appreciate the literary or film qualities of good works of art. But I also want to suggest that they should help us build a bridge, so to say, towards our contemporary culture so that we understand it better, particularly with respect to the works that interest me. And also, it should help us understand better our own experience, like aesthetic experience of a work. Why is it that this work makes us feel shameful or humiliated or whatever, right? So in that sense, it's a kind of three-part or three functions that, on my view, art criticism should do. And again, I'm just putting this here with respect to this work, with respect to some other works. There are also good examples that I want to suggest, but that would kind of be this kind of ethically minded art criticism that I'm suggesting should be put in place rather than restricting or preventing access or censoring and canceling them completely. So that's kind of the thing that I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iris. You got through a lot of material and made us think about an artwork that's not so easy to think about anymore. We've got about 25 minutes for questions, discussion. Who would like to start? Edgar.
Thank you very much, Iris, for this talk. I just have a question on blameworthiness of the author, and I don't understand how it's a problem that Margaret Mitchell. Why do you think it's necessary for Margaret Mitchell not to be blameworthy in order to your account to function? Because it seems that she could be blameworthy, and still there would be this safety net. And so, do you think it would be an argument to cancel the work if she you were blameworthy? I think that's the question.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's a great, one of those that I'm really struggling with quite a lot, particularly with respect to contemporary works of art, because my account, given that it's so much based on the potential of learning, can be extended to, let's just allow all sorts of harmful art which are insulting, etc., if you can learn something. So I'm really struggling to kind of make it clear. I guess what is really important for me in this work is that something that I really didn't understand, how can you as a human being put someone else in the position of of a slave? How can you really do that? And it seems to me, if you really read Scarlett, and if you take Scarlett to be, which is apparently quite how Margaret Mitchell herself was, it seems that really was her view. She just didn't see the moral fault of that. And I think there is something to be said about that. There is, I think, a kind of epistemic potential in arguing that, because she is blind to the moral error, you can maybe get inside of the mind of people who are actually really committing the harm. I mean, yeah, I'm inspired to do that because I've done a research with a colleague of mine who does sociopaths. He's interested in psychopaths and sociopaths. So we were reading tons of interviews with these guys, and it really is something to the claim that they just don't understand what they are doing. And I think that's the kind of the insight that I was trying to capture. How can you do that from the point of view of someone who is just blind to the moral fault that they are committing? That is what kind of drew me into that. But you're absolutely right that the problem with my argument is that it can work even if she was blameworthy. And then that opens the space for me for thinking about, what should we do with contemporary works of art which are in the same sense harmful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good, thank you. Chris early wrote a question in the chat, which I think he managed to, send somewhere between Vid and Robbie raising their hands. So I'm going to take Guy, Vid, and then I'm going to read out Chris's question, and then we'll proceed with the hands on screen. Thank you, Guy.
Great, thanks so much. Really, really interesting talk, Iris. Thanks so much. So I think you're totally bang on that there is a great deal of aesthetic moral value to be had from watching films or reading books like Gone with the Wind, where we can really kind of inhabit a sense of how it feels and how the kind of thought processes work to inhabit a kind of morally corrupt system. But I mean, you mentioned that Gone with the Wind remains the second or third most read book in the US, and I think only a small percentage of the readers of Gone with the Wind in that scenario in the American reading public are going to be doing so with this kind of moral lens that we put on it. I think very, I don't know how many people bought Sarah Churchill's book, but it's going to pale into comparison. And obviously, in an ideal world, everyone would be reading criticism, and criticism would be kind of expanding our sense and providing access to all these potentially harmful works, so that they could actually the good that they can generate can be accessed. But that doesn't seem to be how the world works. At the same time, I think we're well aware from the many eras of history that putting things on censorship lists and blocking access to them for well-meaning reasons or bad reasons just tends to increase the level of and intensity of interest in these things. So I just wonder what you think. How do we, how do you solve that bit if it's the moral aspect which is kind of driven? I mean, I totally buy your argument about the moral value of art criticism in this sense, or ethical art criticism. But how do you square that circle? And maybe people who are saying, okay, the moral thing to do is just ban access to this stuff straightforwardly, because that will deal with the harm, and there's no other way around it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And according to the research that I've done, the moment when the film was removed from the HBO, everybody wanted it, and people were actually paying to see the film that was just few days ago. It was still available. So there is something to this idea. So no, again, I'm completely aware that my model does not work in the real world, right? There's just no way to actually implement that. But what I'm trying to suggest, or kind of the thing why I'm pushing this in this direction, is because of this research project that I have, which is about the value of art and humanities generally. So I'm trying to suggest that there is a crucial educational value that art and art related, let's say, domains of inquiry, by which I mean humanities more generally, are capable of producing the kind of knowledge. You can think of Malcolm Turvey's, if you've seen his recent book on this. That might be the good way to think about it. So I'm trying to show that education in humanities should enable people to be at least somewhat capable of approaching works in this way. And it seems to me that, again, maybe this is just the Croatian model, but when you speak to the students, they want to, they want to cancel Aristotle, they want to cancel Kant and Hume and all sorts of people who, they did have their issues, but just canceling them all, I think there's something deeply problematic about that. So my motivation has been for a few years now to actually show that, we should acknowledge that, we should confront that, but not by removing them or destroying them, etc. So this is why I'm trying to develop this idea that education in humanities should be seen as a first step towards that. And then those who go into the social practices that have to do with public education or public policies with respect to art can be better equipped to kind of sort out these issues. Now, we've just had a case in Croatia where in the middle of the theater here in Rijeka, they had to arrest people because they kept interrupting the ballet performance, completely misunderstanding what was happening on the stage in terms of ethical and political reasons. So that's kind of my motivation. More education could help us make better choices with respect to that.
That's an important point. Thank you. Vid.
Thank you so much, Iris. This was, very good and very thought-provoking. So I think I agree with you when it comes to this, I suppose, binary decision between kind of banning and or not banning, or these preventative measures that are quite strong, and especially now that you've explained, what motivates you. I think that this really makes sense. But I was wondering what you would make of, I guess, things that short stop of full-on, let's say, canceling, but that do have to do with the amount of attention, honor, and perhaps visibility that various works have, right? So it seems to me, I mean, America has this very kind of culturally visible issue of banning things from schools, right? Which tends not to happen so much over here. But of course, we do have debates about what should a theater program that is limited, that can do, I don't know, 10 plays a year, what it should consist of, or which philosophers should be put in the curriculum, right? So you might not ban Kant, but you might just choose not to put Kant on or Gone with the Wind or whatever it is on the curriculum. So does your argument extend to these softer measures, so to speak, that might nevertheless, when cumulatively applied, result in the same result, which is essentially an absence of a work?
Yeah, thank you for that. I was wondering when I was preparing for this and when I was writing the paper itself, I was wondering whether I can employ this kind of general approach and just call them preventive measures. Of course, different preventive measures may seek, and they definitely should be given different justification, right? Something that works for maybe censorship doesn't necessarily work for restricting access, and we already do that. I mean, you can't, the films are not necessarily always available for younger adults, etc. So there are some in progress. Yeah, I think again, working from my idea about this ethically minded art criticism and in collaboration with people who have, let's say, better knowledge on how people actually process different works, then that kind of collaboration should help us decide how to actually approach a particular philosopher or particular work of art, and make decisions on whether to just restrict access, maybe to restrict access for, let's say, lower level of education, but then allow it afterwards. I guess my point now, my first issue now is to just, try to show that banning and expelling and destroying and censorshiping completely want to do the moral job that these people think that it will do. That's kind of the idea that I have. And then the actual specific practice with respect to the actual work may also be something completely different. Also, if you don't use Gone with the Wind, I'm with my colleague in political philosophy, we are now writing a paper about the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And the same kind of arguments that I'm using here are actually quite impotent with respect to Huckleberry Finn. So different works will need different justification for how you actually engage with them, and the kind of approach that I develop here should be invoked for particular works. Yeah.
Good. Thank you both. Okay, here goes Chris's question. I'm going to try to read this out. This argument clearly applies to artworks that we have sufficient historical distance from. However, what would you say about the cancelling of works from which we have not achieved enough historical distance to gain all the epistemic benefits that distance brings? If achieving the right epistemic standing in relation to recent works is much more difficult to achieve, should we cancel harmful recent artworks to protect ourselves from harms which we are not in a good enough epistemic position to block?
Thank you,
Iris.
Chris. Thank you, Chris. That's a great question, very related to the first question. So yeah, that's something that I'm really struggling, because on the one hand, I do want to suggest that there are epistemic benefits to be had, even when when you're talking to someone who is completely crazy, morally crazy, and a terrible human being. Of course, you still learn something about that. But I also don't want to if people like Paul Taylor and Adriana Clavel Vasquez, I think she will also join us here quite shortly now. She also has this amazing article, which is very, it scares you to read that artistic practices can really be, the means that are actually spreading the kind of racism that we try to avoid. So if that is true, then yeah, that I think gives us a reason to really pause and reconsider whether we want these kinds of works to be around. So yeah, that's why I'm very, I'm just talking about distant past. And yeah, hopefully Gone with the Wind is distant enough. Again, it's questionable whether racism is life option today in the same way in which it was life option for Mitchell. My account, I'm trying to suggest that it's not and that it shouldn't be. But if it was, like the analogy that I'm developing is Ted Nanicelli's work on Greek art celebration of pedophilia. So that's not a live option, so we can engage with that. And then Gone with the Wind is maybe somewhere in the middle. So what to do with contemporary art? I think that would maybe even allow us to restrict the work, or maybe even cancel it, or yeah, there is something, a kind of a moral problem is much, I think, severe if someone were to write the novel today. That's kind of the intuition that I have, but I have to develop this. That's the next project, I think. Thank you, Chris.
Good. Thank you, Robbie.
Hi, Iris. That was wonderful. Really, really enjoyed the talk. My question is about something you mentioned kind of near the beginning of the talk about aesthetic harm and the idea that preventing access to these works could be an aesthetic harm.
Yeah.
And so I just first kind of wanted to ask you a bit more about how you're understanding that notion and what could constitute an aesthetic harm. But then second, if you're thinking that these harms could be commensurable with moral harms, because if so, then that would, it seemed to me, open the theoretical possibility that some works give us such aesthetic benefits that they could outweigh whatever moral harms they might also cause or constitute. So just wanted to hear a bit more about that notion. Thanks.
Thank you, Robbie, so much. So yeah, just very, I really liked reading Gone with the Wind, and I grew up during the war, and so much of what Mitchell describes there in terms of war profiteering, the kind of mentality of people, it really resonated with me, and it really kind of helped me understand some of the things that my family was going through, and my neighbors and my friends when we were in this situation. So, and I do think it's an interesting book. It's a nicely written book. The film obviously got all the possible prizes and Oscars and whatever. So what I wanted to do there is to say that, there is a certain aesthetic artistic value that if you ban this work, you lose it. But I think that's also For example, in Croatia, there was this crazy woman who really pushed forward a very aggressive public campaign to banish Flaubert from the schools. And we really had to struggle to say, no, you should keep Flaubert for millions of reasons. So again, this is just my intuition that maybe just from Croatia, but quite a lot of these works that are being canceled are actually aesthetically, artistically excellent works. And to destroy them would really represent a kind of aesthetic harm in that sense. But I don't want to go to make anything further from that, because I don't want my paper to end up being one of those value interaction debates, right? I really don't want to rely, I don't want to go into that, or because it's aesthetically good, so maybe it doesn't matter if it's morally wrong, or it is aesthetically good because it's morally whatever. I just want to, I don't care about that for this particular project. So that's why I am ignoring it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Cole.
Oh, hello, Iris. Great talk. I really enjoyed hearing you speak on this issue.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add just a suggestion. I agree with everything that you said for the most part, but I wonder if how we ought to treat works of art that are potentially harmful is a sort of a radically contextual question. And in other words, if you're dealing with a performance piece and you don't know who the audience is and no one's going to talk about the work afterwards, that's much different than whether to use a work of art in the context of a classroom, for example, where you have a lot of opportunity to direct discussion and to help form the way that people are going to think about the work. So in other words, context is vitally important. And then criticism is one way to think about how to deal with works of art. And the Sarah Churchwell example, I think, is an excellent example of how the critic can treat potentially harmful works of art. But I think that if you're going to deal with it in a context like an educational context, we need to develop a theory of action. In other words, I'm an unrepentant instrumentalist. How are we going to use this work? Are we going to use this work to teach about aesthetics? Are we going to use this work to teach about the potentially harmful uses of art? So in other words, a theory of action within context, I think, could really help to give nuances to this account.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually something that I came across when I was doing the research for Huckleberry Finn. It seems that surprisingly many, if I can say that, Black literary critics were actually more willing and actually very happy to embrace Huckleberry Finn in their classrooms, seeing that work as extremely good for developing or initiating and starting the debate about the racial identity and how it features in that sense. So definitely, with respect to that, there's a lot to be said about who gets to decide what to do and how to treat a particular work. Now, again, in some of my other work, I tried to show that whether or not works actually have impact on us. For some people, they don't. So the whole debate is, I guess, useless. But on my view, I really think we should pay more attention to what psychologists have to say about the way in which we actually respond to works of art. If there is a chance that works of art can be harmful in this way, that I think gives a different, sense to these kind of questions than if everything is just, subjective, philosophical ideas that this might be harmful or not. So I definitely want to encourage research on, anti-heroes, whether they can morally corrupt us, on violent art, on pornographic art. And then once we have that knowledge, we are in a better position to then decide whether we should put a particular performance or not. But I also think that we should have, and this is again my defense of humanities more generally, there is a way to make these kind of debates more prominent. If you just think about the media and the way in which they, the book clubs, the online forums, etc., etc. If educated people were, or if people were better educated in artistic practices with respect to these sorts of things, if they could contribute, that would already be something, right? So, through better education that begins at the elementary school and then proceeds higher up, right? I think that is the kind of approach that I'm trying to suggest would work best for these ideas. Thank you.
Great. Very good. John's next.
A really small point about how you set up the moral problem of the film and the problem of moral whether when an artist is morally blameworthy. So great talk, by the way. Thank you so much.
Thank
But
you.
at crucial points, you describe the problem of the film as racism or having racist attitudes. And I think we need a more fine-grained moral description. So it seems to take a pro attitude towards the institution of chattel slavery, right? That's much stronger than it expresses racist attitudes. It represents the institution of slavery as compatible with, if not flourishing of the enslaved, then at least they have pretty good lives. It misrepresents that institution. And that, from the beginning to the end of the modern slave trade, was that was an issue that was debated. It's why the European firms that were partly responsible for the transatlantic slave trade they had no slave markets in Europe. The issue had been settled there, but there were throughout the Americas. So this was, its morality was hotly contested from beginning to end. And everyone would be expected to be aware of the moral problem of the modern slave trade and the institution of slavery throughout the Americas,
Yeah.
particularly in the U.S., right? We've had Frederick Douglass publish What to the Slave is the 4th of July. 80 years before that, it was published in The Atlantic, and Du Bois had been publishing in Harper's. So small, little tiny, small, friendly suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. In the paper where I'm writing this, I actually make a slight claim where I'm suggesting that maybe slavery is no longer a live option, but racism definitely is, and this kind of a question. So again, the only thing that I can say here is to go back to this idea about the slowness as it is of moral progress generally at the level of not only of an individual but of society generally. So in that respect, again, although they of course were quite obviously very familiar with all the opposite moral views, the moral pioneering views, and this whole, and again, Sarah Churchwell describes this very nicely in her book. It still seems to me that again, they just this failure to recognize the kind of a moral harm that we do. And then in the paper, I developed the analogy with, the contemporary society treatment of animals. Maybe 20, 30, 40 years from now, people will look back and say, how could you eat meat, at the beginning of 21st century? So that's the kind of model that I'm trying to but you're absolutely right. It's not as black and white as maybe I am presenting it. And it is questionable whether I can really claim that it's no longer a live option or that she was really as blameless as my argument here stands. But again, given the kind of this dominance of, and they're excellent. I mean, really, it really shakes you to the core to see the historical accounts from politicians, from sociologists, from eminent intellectuals about how ingrained this belief was that Black people were simply not at the same level as white people. So that for me, I really wasn't aware of just how powerful this belief was, and that I think is what really gets through in this respect. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Good. We've got one more question. Not a lot of time, but I'm assuming it's okay if we run a few minutes over. Our last person to ask a question is Rebecca.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sue. This is really interesting. And I'm generally sympathetic to the idea that kind of exposure and dialogue discussion can have this kind of epistemic value. But I think my question, kind of like some of the others, has been worried about kind of the threat or dangers of kind of normalizing certain problematic perspectives in virtue of this kind of approach. I was thinking about Zoe Williams's work on kind of morally problematic jokes, and how one of the issues there is that, or at least one of the reasons why these jokes are so problematic, is that it brings in a moral perspective or kind of a claim into the common ground. In order to get the joke, you need to have this immoral or kind of problematic like common ground, this immoral kind of general standpoint, and it kind of brings that into kind of focus, and it makes it more normalized. So is there a danger that all kind of immoral or morally problematic artworks do this, or is it maybe a feature of certain artworks, and then maybe require different kinds of approaches to tackle them, depending on kind of how much of this kind of like perspective uptake is apparent. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's good to see you again. So that's a great question, and I'm very worried about it because given the research that I've done on from psychological point of view about the impact of violent art, it seems that there's a lot of evidence which suggests that if you keep watching violent films, they really change the way in which you think about violence itself. It changes the way in which you perceive the world, and of course it changes your belief about the justification of violent action. And maybe the same thing, and I think this is what people like Stacy Friend and Chris Goffin would say, or Adriana Clavel and Paul Taylor would say, that given the dominance of, let's say, white perspective in contemporary in art generally, we really run the risk of completely failing to recognize the problems with this kind of perspective. But this is what I'm suggesting that, and this is why I am against restricting access to particular works. We need them all. So read Gone with the Wind one day, but then also read, A Runaway Slave at the Pilgrim Point by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which is, I think, it really shakes you to the core when you read the Black slave perspective on what was done to her and how she was killed, raped, and her partner killed, and then she kills her baby. So that's kind of my countermeasure to just, Frederick Douglass, to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So just, let's take in as much as we can. And then hopefully, even if there is a potentially harmful impact from one work, it can be kind of counterbalanced by the counter views that other works of art are giving us. And again, within the context of art criticism, where someone can come and explain to you, look, they might, they were wrong. You can't do that, and explains to you why you can't do that. Then hopefully that kind of engagement with works is going to neutralize or at least lessen the potentially harmful impact that certain works can have. Hopefully. I don't know much about jokes. Sorry, that's an art form that I'm really not exploring, so I really can't say whether the jokes might be particularly problematic or non-problematic domain. Thank you.
Good. Well, thanks all for great questions and very nice discussion.
Thank you,
A
guys.
special thanks to Iris, our speaker today, for a very important and interesting talk. We've already run over time, and so the only thing that remains to be said is that we hope to see you again next time. Guy, the exact date for the next seminar, do you have it on top of your head when Adriana Clavel Vasquez will be speaking?
It's in 2 weeks exactly.
2 weeks.
And the exact date, I think,
is it the 4th of December? Might be.
December, so same time, Adriana Clavel Vasquez. Yeah, great. Thanks so much for today.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.